So after establishing and answering the many, many questions, maybe more than any other question, the issue of secular education, of what is the role of, is there a role, and what is the role of secular education in a Chassidish home, a Chassidish education? Is there a place for it, is it not? We discussed at length the Rebbe's Sichos, especially in the early years, and then later as well, but especially in Tezvav and Tezayin and Tavshin Chav, Simchus Teira, Achar Shel Pesach, and I will definitely list which Sichos in the coming episodes, discussing that the bottom line that the Rebbe was battling was the issue of tachlis, that it became a type of worship, of feeling that the only way to survive, to succeed, the measure of success in this world is through a college education, the only way to make a livelihood. And that was the Rebbe's main battle. What I want to address today, in this episode, is a little more the effect and the meaning of secular education. What is this Chachmas Chitzenius, Chachmas Umas Elam, the different words that are different names given for it. I also addressed then that story with the circle and the center, that in order to understand knowledge in general is a tool. And the most important thing for a person is to know their mission in this world. If your mission, if you get distracted from your mission because you have gone off to some type of side show and made the means an end, that was the main problem, the ikar issue the Rebbe dealt with. So we have to understand, as I discussed then, what exactly is the role of education, secular education. At the end of the day, the fact is that God created this world, and there is a logic and a knowledge to understand the world, whether it's medicine or other sciences, the physical, the liberal, the social sciences. Many of them are objective the study of the universe. So let us begin with learning Tanya inside. We're going to learn chapter 8 in Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe talks about this. It's just a few lines, but it's filled with meaning. So let's just learn it inside, and I'll translate together with the Rebbe's commentary on this Tanya. On the end of chapter 8, in general chapter 8, the Alter Rebbe is discussing that when a person gets involved, immersed in things of this world, what impact it has on his neshama. So we know there's Klippas Nega, there's Sholosh Klippas Atmeis. So in chapter 8, he discusses the issue of different immersions. So he begins to talk about different people speaking about things like Dvarim Betelim, Dvarim Isurim, Litzonis, Lashon Hara, Kayetze Bezem, Shem Sholosh Klippas Atmeis Legamri. That when a person speaks about really in things that are prohibited, we're not talking about not neutral matters. Divrei Reshus, Litzonis, making fun, sarcasm, Lashon Hara, speaking evil about others. That's Sholosh Klippas Atmeis. Then he goes on and says, what about someone who's efshel lasik b'teira ve'esik b'dvarim b'teilim? He's able to learn studying Teira. Instead, he uses it not something prohibited. Dvarim b'teilim means simply not learning Teira. So he talks about all the so-called cleansing and the cause and effect that this has. But then he concludes, v'chena esik b'chochmas umas ha'elam b'chlal dvarim b'teilim yachshav. Even oven bittul Teira. When a person studies Chochmas Umas Ha'elam, what does Chochmas Umas Ha'elam means? It means the wisdom of the nations of the world. It means accumulated wisdom that human beings came up on their own, even if it's correct, even if it's important, and even if it's truth. We're not talking about just an opinion. So this is considered like oven bittul Teira. Alter Rebbe refers to Hilchos Talmud Teira. So we're not discussing necessarily that it's necessarily a davar asur that's prohibited. It's just compared to learning Teira. Why are you studying that when you should be studying Teira, which is the primary reason you came to this world, which is to serve God, to understand God, and understand what God wants of us. So even though it has Chachma, it's called Chachmas Umas Ha'elam, it's wisdom. It's not just sitting and talking folly, meaningless things. But it's not Teira, so it's considered bittul Teira compared to that. Like he says, that v'debarta bom shalei Teira v'imam dvarim acherim, as he brings in Hilchos Talmud Teira, You should speak bum in divrei Torah, and not in things that have no connection to that. Then he continues. Then the Alter Rebbe continues. After saying what he just said, in addition, not only is it dvarim b'telim in the sense that you could have studied Torah, and instead you did something that's not divrei Torah, there's a tumah yisera, an impurity, a spiritual impurity that actually defiles you, that comes from Chochmas al Tumas Dvarim B'Telim. That's more than the defilement that comes from just talking about things that have no meaning. She'ena malbish u'metame rak hamidus mi'yesed haruach HaKodesh shebenafshei elekis. Because when a person just speaks matters of folly, or just plays a game. Last week I read a question, someone said, what is it better to play games? We're not talking about violent games, we're not talking about prohibited games. Better to just play a game than study some secular wisdom? The answer is, in one sense, yes. Why? Because just plain neutral dvarim b'telim, when I say neutral, I mean nothing prohibited, but nothing of content, that's just metama the midas of a person. Betumas klipas nega, shebedvarim b'telim haboyim yisei daruach harasha b'klipas zu nefesh habam is kidliel. But it does not metama leibchinas Chabad benafshe, because it doesn't require intellect. It doesn't require applying your mind to it. Ma'achas shem divrei shtus uburus, because those things, dvarim b'telim, are just divrei shtus uburus, which means emptiness, things filled with vanity. Burus is also things that are just ilam haza shagam shetim v'ameyorot shechem ledaber. Cain. It doesn't require any particular intelligence or wisdom. It's something anybody can talk about. Plain gossip or plain talk about that. We're not talking about lashon hara. So anyone can talk. So it's metama. It does defile a person because everything you do affects your spirit. But it doesn't defile only. It defiles only the midas, not the mech. By contrast, when a person uses his mind and studies the wisdom of the world, of the nations, this is in contrast to the wisdom of Torah. He actually encloses and defiles also Chabad benafshe, Helikis, of his divine soul. The tumas klipas negesh b'chochmas elu. With the defilement, with the impurity of the klipas nega of Shabchachim Seli. The emphasis here is klipas nega, which means we're not talking about studying a wisdom, let's say Avodah Zarah. To study Avodah Zarah, and we'll soon discuss Sanhedrin and so on, is prohibited. That goes in the prohibition, that goes in Shalosh Klipas Atmei's category. Or to study other things that are Divrei Znus, for example. Or other matters that are not appropriate. That's what we're not talking about. We're talking about neutral scientific wisdom, let's say. Neutral chachmas umas. That's klipas nega, but it's still metama because you could have used your mind to sanctify it with spiritual and divine thoughts and ideas, and instead you're defiling now the mind. It's not just plain talk that like he said, that anybody can do. Here you need your mind. Shenoflu shama. Because this wisdom, the wisdom of the world, the wisdom of the nations, is wisdom that comes from acharayim. Real wisdom is the divine wisdom. A reflection of that, you can say. The outer dimension of Chochmah, the Kedusha is Chochmah, the acharayim is Chochmah Chitzenius. We'll soon discuss why. And then he's going to make the key exemption, an exception which I want to address. Because that, of course, is the key twist to saying why is it possible to study and why some did study, etc. But let me explain a moment what the case is here. What's the difference between two wisdom? If someone sits and studies mathematics, or physics, or medicine, or law, or whatever it is, why is that some type of chokhmah, wisdom, that is more defiling than lahavdil, chokhmah of Torah? The answer is very simple. It goes back to what I discussed in the last episode. The reason we were sent to this earth is not just to be wise people and to study about the world, understand it, and even make money as a result. That's not why we're sent. We're sent to the world to transform the world and make it adira b'tachteina. So what wisdom do we need primarily? The wisdom how to do that. The wisdom to fulfill the purpose. When you say something is pnimi, something chitzeni is, for example, when you want to build a building, your interest is the home that you want to build for yourself and your family. However, as a means to get there in this world, the only way to do that is to hire architects and contractors and people who are experts, who know the wisdom of engineering and of construction and of design, etc., and architecture. It's a means to an end. But if you suddenly make the means the end and say, you know what, the most important thing is to be the architect, and you forget the purpose for what you're building the home, that's called chocham's chitzenius. Why chitzenius? Because you're focusing not on the ikka, not on the purpose of it. You're talking on the outside of it. Acharayim of chachma d'kedusha. So is there such a wisdom in the world? Absolutely. It evolves from the wisdom of the divine wisdom that God used to create the universe, which evolves in turn from where? From the divine plan. So everything begins with Torah. That's why we say Estakel Baraisa Bar Alma, that God looked at the Torah and created the world. The Torah is the blueprint for what? Even for science and for math. So for a person to focus on the means when they should be focusing, and they could be focusing on the end, that is called defiling the mind, when the mind could have been used. In addition to the reason that he gave earlier, that is Dvarim B'Teilim compared to the study of Torah. So it would be like saying you've gotten hijacked, your mind has been hijacked by a sideshow. Is it have value? Of course it has value. It's part of the wisdom of the world. Remember, as I said then, the wisdom of the world is also understanding God's mind, but it's God's mind as he applies himself to creating the world. Now he continues. Elim Cain, here's the exception. Two exceptions, yes. If he takes this wisdom, the math or the science or the chokhmas or umas as he calls it, this outer wisdom that I described, and makes from it kardem, an axe, a tool with which to cut down a tree, so to speak, with which to use it for a purpose that is something that is part of the purpose of your life, then it's permitted. For example, he says, Dahainu, Kedei lisparnes mehen berevach laved Hashem. In order to sustain himself, berevach, the Alter Rebbe adds, we'll emphasize that in a moment, berevach means not just the minimum, berevach means with a profit that you make more than necessary to serve God. That's one exception. Because then you've reconnected this outer wisdom with the inner wisdom. Because you're studying it not just to know or to make money or to have a job. You're studying it in order to help elevate the world, to sustain yourself and your family, and in order to serve God. The Rebbe has a ha'ara here in the word revach that tells us a big chiddush. It means that even if you could make a livelihood, a minimum livelihood, without studying any secular education, still, you want to live a little more comfortably, and you want to live in a way that's more than you just need. One could argue, you know what? If you can make a livelihood without studying this and just studying Torah, why are you going to study? But even if you want to make profit and become wealthy, but if it's Lavid Hashem, that's the purpose, it's also acceptable. Because there's no problem with making parnos. There's no problem with becoming wealthy either. In Torah, wealth is a bracha, a blessing. The goal here is not poverty. The question is, what is this wisdom being used for? Is it an end in itself, or is it for a purpose, l'shem shamayim? A second way, shiyadeya lishtamish behen lavedas Hashem or the terase. Or if you know how to use this wisdom, chokhmas umis, to serve God or Torah, then that's also permitted. So the first is for parnasa, revach even, lavid Hashem, to serve God. Here is to know how to use the wisdom, not just to make to do a trade, any job or profession that helps you make money, and then you could serve God better, whether it's through zakah or through actually being a person who has more means so you can spend time serving God more, or the actual chokhmah, the wisdom itself, you know how to use for Avodas Hashem or for Torah, which means different ways that it elevates you to Torah, and I'll discuss that in a moment. Then the Alter Rebbe concludes, Perek Ches, V'zeh Taimer Shel HaRambam v'Ramban Zal v'Siyaiton she'osku behen. This is the reason of the Rambam, Maimonides, and Ramban, Nachmanides, and others like them, Siyaiton. And similar, that osku behen, that were involved in these Chochmas U'umis, because they weren't just studying it for shleimus to be knowledgeable, they were studying it because they knew how to use it for Torah, for Avodas Hashem or Torah. The Rebbe has a letter, a very interesting letter in Tafshin Tes, that is printed in the Hisofis of the Likutei Sichos Chelik Yud Beis and also in Igrus Kodesh. I believe volume 2, if I'm correct. Let me just check. Yes, volume 2. And there, volume 3, page 124. The letters from Yud Tes Siv and Tavshin Tes. And then there's a follow-up letter that the Rebbe wrote to someone who asked him continuing questions on this topic. From Yud Gimel Menachem of Tavshin Tes. Printed in the same volume 3 on page 169. So page 124 and 169 in volume 3 of Igrus Kodesh. The Rebbe there spells out and explains this Tanya. It spells out actually 6 levels, which I'm not going to go through in detail now. I'll just read them quickly. 6 ways that you can use Chochmas U'umis Avodas Hashem l'Teirasei. And maybe you can include also the first thing, Parnasa Barchova. The first way is that you know this wisdom not from the wisdom, but you know it from Torah, because Torah is like the map. Like I said before, you look in the Torah, and that's how you know it. Then there's ways where the Torah actually says a mitzvah that you should learn. For example, Hilchos Kiddush HaChedesh. So Bezdin has to calculate astronomical calculations. So it's a mitzvah to learn this wisdom. Number 3, that when you're in a situation where you cannot think of Divrei Torah, for whatever reason, because you're in a place that you're not supposed to think Torah, and so you use your mind to think about some wisdom of the world. So it's also a mitzvah, but in a negative way. Not to do it, but you can't do Torah, so you do that. Number 4, that you want to learn Torah or perform a mitzvah, but you can't do it without some knowledge. And this gives the example of Rav that went 18 months to study with a shepherd. So he should learn the different things, the different mumim, the different blemishes and wounds that an animal has for halacha. So it's not Torah, not mitzvah. As before, it's a mitzvah to be mechadish chedesh. It's just that he couldn't figure it out, so it's like a hechsher mitzvah, a hechsher l'Torah mitzvahs. Number 5, k'dei limtza parnasaseh, like we said, the first point, in order to sustain yourself, or that the work you do from this, you use it as a hechsher achana l'davar heter. And then number 6, is what says in Tanya here, that you're allowed to learn these chochmas because you know how to use them lechatchila, not for the other reasons that we described before. You know how to use them initially for the Alter Rebbe's Lashon, Avodas Hashem Teraseh. You can look it up and learn it more in detail. I think let's suffice with that. I just want to add one more thing that I think is important. And we'll of course discuss this further, how you apply this to our lives. The bottom line is, from all of this we know, is that before we talk about sex education and how to answer questions going to college, parnasa, can you make a livelihood, can you not, etc., we have to understand what we're talking about. That's why I began with the tachlis. What's the most important thing is the mission. Now we've learned and understand what is the nature of Chochmas U'umis and why Taka the Torah has an issue with it. Because what it does is, it distracts you and can make from the means an end. In addition to what I said earlier about the defilement, etc. One more thing that's very important to point out. There was a line they say that today many people think there's a higher rate of literacy. So some wise man once said, that's not really the case. The only difference today and the past was today illiterate people know how to read. God forbid that all this discussion is not an advocating illiteracy. Jews never advocated illiteracy. We're literate people. The question is what literacy means. Does literacy meaning knowing a lot? Like that same fellow who said that people read more and more about less and less. So you can read a lot and know a lot. Is literacy knowing a lot, or literacy is knowing what to use it for? And that's the key focus that I wanted to make. And hopefully in the next episode we'll address more details and answering specific questions about the Parnasa and other matters that I read, and I will read more as we go along. Okay.